Right, folks, can you have your attention, Vice President, please? Must be nice to be called Vice President now. Takes a weight off your shoulder, I remember it well. Okay, welcome to this second session in our two-part symposium for BERA and AARE. Can I just have an indication of how many of you came to the session this morning? So most, but not quite all. Okay, there will be some common ground, but we'll go through it quickly. But the big difference between this morning's session and this session is that we are going to look not just at reform at a high policy level, we're going to look at reform and reconceptualization of teacher education on the ground through some case studies. But before we do that, we're going to give a bit of context which relates to what was said this morning. And the first thing to say is there's a sort of dominant reform mantra that has been around in the world for the last 20 years or so, most recently represented in the work of OECD and McKinsey, and this was all mentioned this morning. What matters most in becoming one of the best school systems in the world is getting and keeping good teachers. So, what follows from that? We need to improve teaching by raising the quality of entrance to the teaching profession and the quality of teacher education programs. And how is this done? Well, there's been a conventional wisdom that says recruit better qualified students into teacher education, increase the length of teacher training courses, make them more academically rigorous, and incorporate what used to be teacher training colleges into universities. And that, I would say, has been the conventional wisdom around the world for the last 20 years or more. And then another part of it has been that regulation is better than deregulation, and therefore you have lots of either government or profession-led standards and competencies and requirements of training courses. What we're going to look at is how far Australia and England follow that conventional wisdom and the extent to which they're moving in a different direction. We're going to start with Australia.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Jenny Gore from the University of Newcastle, Australia. And the conventional wisdom that Geoff's just outlined is pretty much in line with how Australian teacher education reform has progressed. So we've seen the amalgamation of teachers' colleges with universities that happened in the late 1980s. We've seen longer programs come into being. It used to be that people did 3-year qualifications. They now do 4 years as a standard thing in the undergraduate area. And we've recently seen a push from 1 year to 2 years as a requirement for all people doing postgraduate teacher education programs. We've had state-level accreditation of teacher education programs around for a while. They've now been superseded in a way by the establishment of the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership, which is a national program of accreditation of teacher education programs. And because of that national regulation, it means that there's less wiggle room, if you like, for individual programs to vary greatly, although as we'll describe in a moment with the 2 case studies, it still allows some degree of innovation within programs. Despite our national system of accreditation, we have state-level implementation of that, and it's very interesting how Australian states still like to stamp their own mark on reforms. So while there's a national system, states like my own, New South Wales, insist on elaborating the standards for teacher education programs, so they have another layer of regulation on top. What we have in the Australian context, though, is a fairly large system of teacher education. As you can see here, nearly 18,000 graduates in the most recent year that we have data for, 2013, and going into a workforce of around 260,000 teachers. One of the things that gets spoken about quite a lot, particularly in recent reform arguments coming out of government and the media, is this next image here, which shows that in Australia, even though we have something like 40, varies a bit, 38, 39 universities, so there's 48 institutions providing teacher education. There's 450 teacher education programs, and this is often seen as a bit of a criticism that we've had the proliferation of programs. But what that doesn't address is the fact that every teacher education program that's doing, that's doing teacher education at the secondary level has a separate program for every subject specialisation. So English, maths, science, physical education, drama education, whatever, there are multiple programs that effectively in many of our institutions have the exact same structure, at least within the particular institution. But this is talked about quite a bit. But as you can see there, we've got nearly 80,000 undergraduate students enrolled in teacher education annually. And then we have the kind of government rhetoric of this kind. Diane showed this similar slide this morning, or at least the same words. Criticisms that our teacher education programs are too theoretical, too ideological, too faddish, and so on. Great image of Christopher Pine. But in the end, what we have now is a fairly highly regulated system. There are only 4 pathways into teaching in Australia. You do a 3-year undergraduate course and a 2-year postgrad study of teaching. You do a 4-year integrated program in a couple of different modes. And there is a clause about some other combination that's approved by the governing body, AARE, and that opens the space up for alternative modes like Teach for Australia. We do have a small Teach for Australia program that's been operating since about 2009, I think. But it's really a very small part of the terrain. Pretty much everyone is still involved in university-based teacher education of this kind of 4 or 5-year duration. We heard this morning also about the endless reviews of teacher education that happen in Australia, the latest being the report of the Ministerial Advisory Group into Teacher Education. And increasingly, the rhetoric is around the quality of the entrance coming into teacher ed. So there's a lot of argument at the moment about how we identify the top 30% of the population, because we really should only have the best and brightest people becoming teachers, because how can they possibly teach bright students unless they've been high achieving academically themselves? And arguments for literacy and numeracy testing as a requirement of all graduates of programs. And I know the deans at the moment are in debate with government and with the regulators about the degree to which that kind of system of testing should happen as a condition of employment or a condition of graduation from university programs, and it's a space that's still contested at the moment. Our Education Minister talking about how testing in literacy and numeracy will give teacher employers and the public confidence in the skills of graduating teachers, as if literacy and numeracy is the key marker of the skill of a teacher. And again, these sorts of statements get made and taken up by the media relatively uncritically. We are in Australia at the moment in a fairly complex time, and it's quite critical, I think, at this juncture as to which direction we're going to head in. There is this notion of restricting entry to the best and brightest, but at the same time we have calls to widen participation in general in higher education. And we know historically that more students from low SES backgrounds, people who are first in family, come into teaching than some of the other degrees. So the very moment that we're in of trying to restrict entry at the same time as widening participation puts those two kind of discourses in competition with each other. We have universities under really severe financial pressure at the moment. And so one of the ways in which universities manage their finances, of course, is to keep big cohorts of teacher education students, because teacher education is relatively inexpensive compared to some other degrees. So if we're about to reduce our cohorts in teacher education, there may be serious consequences for the viability of some institutions. We also have really serious problems of teacher attrition, and there's lots of talk of shortages among teachers. We already have shortages in certain areas, particularly geographic areas, and in subject areas like science and maths teaching. We are, though, seeing this increased pressure on looking at outputs from teacher education programs rather than inputs. And while there's a lot to be gained, I think, from a professionally defensible perspective in saying we ought to be worried more about outputs than inputs, that's also at the moment been translated into looking at the impact of teacher education programs. And of course that takes us to this really complex issue of how we measure the quality of teaching or the quality of teacher education. And so the work in the US that's been done around value-added measures, there's a lot of criticism of the adequacy of those measures for looking at the impact of teacher ed programs. Australia is poised at the moment to start its own system of impact measurement and deciding how that might be done. And I think it's a really critical space that we need to watch, but it's not yet resolved. So that's a kind of 8-minute outline of the teacher ed reform context in Australia. What I've been asked to do now is to present the 2 case studies from my institution, the University of Newcastle. I do have a number of colleagues who've worked on the case study papers that our discussant has seen, but I was the only one who was able to make the long journey from Newcastle, Australia, to Belfast. So unfortunately, you'll have to listen to me for another 14 or 15 minutes as I present the 2 cases. The first one I want to talk about is a program that we're running called the National Exceptional Teachers for Disadvantaged Schools program, working with Drew Miller, Margot Ford and Joe Aylwood. This program is really designed to get the best quality education graduates into disadvantaged schools and to help prepare them to not only choose to work in disadvantaged schools, but to succeed in those contexts. The key features of the program are that high achieving, in terms of high GPA, pre-service teachers are selected around the end of the second year of their teacher education program and brought together as a cohort. So all of those high achieving students are in one tutorial group. They meet for at least a semester, often more like a year. There are some extracurricular activities that help to bond them. There's a Facebook group where they post articles of interest and so on. They work in that tutorial on a lot more work than is standard in the program for their peers on understanding poverty, disadvantage, working with and how to support students from low SES schools and communities. And they also have a practicum in low SES schools that is better supported, if you like, than the average practicum, because there are some extra resources available for this program. They have extra academic visits and they have phone check-ins. Now, what the program does is really try to redistribute, if you like, the best teachers across the full range of schools in terms of SES, and to also address the attrition of early career teachers from those kinds of contexts. We have quite high levels of attrition in Australia. I think the latest figures are around 40% of graduating teachers intend to leave teaching within the first 5 years. And so by providing that extra support, the idea is that we can keep those young people, or early career teachers, in teaching a bit longer. This program began at the Queensland University of Technology, who are now with their 4th cohort of students. And what they've found is that there are higher levels of employment for the graduates of those programs. They were already pretty high. But significantly, a lot more of them are now working in low SES schools, going from about 35% in those contexts to about 88% of them working in low SES. Because of these successes, there's now been a national expansion of the program to other institutions, and the University of Newcastle was one of the next 2 universities to come into the program. We started with our first cohort in 2014, 34 students. Quite differently from QUT, 26% of our students themselves attended low SES schools. The group at Queensland University tend to be much higher SES students themselves. So it's a different cohort. We've got a little bit of initial data that's very preliminary, but some measures of teacher efficacy are showing that this group see themselves as having higher efficacy. Now it may be because they've been selected and identified as high achieving. But it's the interview data that I think has been more interesting than that. And what we're hearing is that they're really valuing the sorts of provisions that are provided in the program, such as the extra tutorial support and practicum support, and also the new insights that they've gained from being in that social justice kind of environment and tutorial. And we hear them saying the sorts of things that you would expect from such a program. You know, I want the students I teach to believe in themselves, and it doesn't matter where they came from. I grew up in a housing commission area myself. I want them to know that no matter where you come from and who you are, if you believe in yourself, you can achieve it. This kind of statement you would expect. What we also hear, though, is some more utilitarian ambitions that are typical, according to some of the literature at least, in teacher education students. You know, anything I can get on my resume that's going to put me above the pack is what I'm going to do. And, you know, it scares me to think how many graduates there are and how am I going to differentiate myself from others. So I'll be in this program because it probably will help me get a decent job. And in any case, I'm going to develop some better skills from being a part of this program. So those kinds of typical concerns, which are quite understandable. Some of the key challenges of the program, I think, that are worth thinking about. We might be providing extra support for the highest achieving students through this program in the name of greater equity for schools, but what about equity within the program? So those students who are already doing really well in the teacher ed program are getting the extra support. What about the others who might need it more? We have high academic achievement as a proxy for quality. Is high academic achievement equivalent to being an exceptional teacher? What is the evidence on which this kind of rests about the relationship between academic achievement and success? There's this fine line between building commitment to working in low SES schools and putting a high level of moral pressure on these graduates to choose to teach in environments where there might potentially be negative consequences for them if they really have gone into those schools, even though it's not really for them. There is a question of the adequacy of the support that's provided. Some of the students are talking about how they still want more practical know-how. You know, it's all very well to understand disadvantage better, but they really need to know how to work in those contexts. And of course, there's other literature that talks about how the immersion for students or teacher ed students who've come from more privileged backgrounds in high poverty contexts can actually reinforce negative views. And these are things to be looking out for, I think, as this program expands. But what the program does do, I think, in terms of the reform context, is it really does reclaim the kind of space that Teach for Australia and its international equivalents occupies. It takes that ideological agenda and it says, okay, we might want the best and brightest in these poor schools, but let's at least take education students, those who've made a vocational commitment to teaching rather than people who've come from some other degree background. It interrupts that traditional pathway where the best students get the best jobs, and you see the quotes around all of that, because now we are seeing so-called best students choosing perhaps what were historically some of the worst jobs. And it really requires us in teacher education to directly confront this challenge of how we prepare graduates to succeed in some of those tough environments. So it's a kind of a very odd or different kind of program. The second case that I'm going to talk about, and I hope our timekeeper's restarting my time, is a more conventional program. It's the Master of Teaching program at the University of Newcastle, and a lot of this work is done with my colleague Julie Bowe. And this program is really designed to overcome some of the fragmentation that is a typical criticism of teacher education programs. In a number of ways, the curriculum is structured in such a way to integrate some of the knowledge that teacher ed students are required to address. But we have conferences at the beginning of each semester where, rather than the students being drip-fed their content every week of the semester, there's an intention to try and give them the whole picture and to look at how the different courses that they're taking in the semester might relate to each other, to set them up to then have that bigger picture sense of where they're heading. We also have showcases at the end of every semester where the students in groups report on what they've learned in an integrated way for their semester's work. And we use the quality teaching framework, which is a particular pedagogical framework, to orient a whole lot of their learning, and I'll talk briefly about that in a moment. So that's one of the key intentions. The other is really to prepare them for the kind of work that teachers do in collaboration with each other, solving problems, inquiring into their own practice, and so on. And that's done through the process we call quality teaching rounds, which has these students working in professional learning communities from the very beginning of their program. We're also very much looking at the enduring problem of the knowledge base for teaching and the challenges that we face in effectively moving forward, knowing what is effective teaching. And even though what we provide to fill that space is in no way the final answer there, it provides a really strong starting point for critical conversations about what counts as good practice. It helps with the integration of theory and practice, and because schools are using the quality teaching framework as well in New South Wales, then there's less of that mismatch between schools and universities where university students are told to forget everything they've learned in university because here's the real world. We're also working very much with partner schools, and they are using the same processes of quality teaching rounds and working with teachers in the schools, participating with our students in this process. I don't have time to go into much detail, but the quality teaching model looks like this in very broad strokes. There are 3 dimensions to the model: concern for the intellectual quality of students' learning, a real concern for the quality of the learning environment, and a concern about making learning more significant for students. And with each dimension, there's 6 elements, and the materials that go with the quality teaching model have a 1 to 5 kind of coding system with descriptors of what each element looks like at a low level through to a high level as a basis for discussion. It's not that one should strive for 5s in everything. In fact, it's inappropriate to sometimes strive for a 5 in a particular subject. One example I often use as a former physical education teacher is that when I teach javelin, the element called student direction will score a 1. It's not explore the javelin time, it's you will not move until I blow my whistle to collect the javelin. But it's a basis for conversation, and we're finding that that's really a very powerful way of helping to structure and integrate all of that information. And you will see that in this framework, there's a whole lot in there about the quality of ideas, about knowledge, about teaching practice, and about equity. And it's all embedded in a fairly sophisticated way in there. The quality teaching rounds process involves groups of teachers or student teachers or mixed groups coming together, doing professional reading discussions so that they get to know each other as professionals and their ideas and beliefs, observing in classrooms, each other teaching, watching whole lessons always, not walkthroughs of lessons, coding and discussing those lessons, and really encouraging them not to talk just about that lesson, but to talk about our practice and how and why we teach this way and what it means and so on. That's a 30-second summary of each of those processes. So the whole agenda here, I guess, is primarily about enhancing the teacher education program, that more coherent vision of what is quality, the alignment with what's going on in schools as a particular strength of the program, and that real clinical approach to the analysis and refinement of practice, with attention to issues, I guess, as I say at the bottom, of how we collaborate effectively, acknowledging issues of power relations and inquiry processes and so on. Some of the challenges in this program, and it's only with its second cohort, so we don't even have a group of graduates yet from the program. But the logistics for students, we know this, coming together as groups, particularly out of class time, is increasingly difficult in environments where people coming into teacher education programs have full and busy lives. And also buy-in among colleagues is a big issue, because anything that challenges the autonomy of academics to teach the way they want to or teach what they want to buy into a common vision of what is good teaching or good teacher education is a fraught endeavour, but we certainly have made some inroads there. Part of that, of course, relates to that broader contestation over what constitutes good teaching and how it might be judged. And as a profession, we've struggled with this, and it's something I think that gets in the way of progress, used again in quotation marks, because without us as a profession having any agreement about this, then others are stepping into that space. We haven't yet gathered evidence in the pre-service context. But what we can say is that the agenda really does share with government this concern to improve both the quality of teaching and teacher education. So it aligns with government agendas, but is taking it in a very different direction that's based not on the ideological so much as our own research and beliefs about teacher education. It addresses the knowledge base for teaching, the theory-practice nexus, and preparation for ongoing learning as a teacher through collaborative practice with colleagues. And we have recently completed a randomised controlled trial into quality teaching rounds with practising teachers, not with student teachers, where we've found effect sizes of 0.3 to 0.4 with a fairly short-term intervention for the quality of teaching that's been produced. And to get those kinds of results with an RCT for practising teachers really does, I guess, offer us quite considerable cause for optimism as to how this might impact on preparing graduate students from our teacher education program who have confidence and a level of skill that really does set them up for success in teaching. So I hand over now, I believe, to Geoff, who's going to give a similar outline of the the English context. I've also learnt, Simone, that we must say England, not UK, and some case studies to follow.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay, just briefly on the English reform agenda pre-2010, because you remember the conventional wisdom that I talked about at the beginning, which Jenny said was largely reflected in the Australian case study. Well, that was reflected in the English reforms pre-2010, particularly with the Council for the Accreditation of Teacher Education 1984 onwards, Teacher Training Agency, Ofsted inspection, competencies and standards. That all fitted very much with the conventional global wisdom, and even new routes to qualified teacher status that came in from 1992 onwards didn't really disrupt the system very much. By the time the coalition government came in 2010, you still had three main routes: higher education-led partnerships, the school-centred initial teacher training, and employment-based routes, including Teach First. And the extent to which the conventional model, conventional wisdom reigned is shown in that, because the vast majority of students training to be teachers before 2010 were training in university or higher education-led institutions, partnerships. So the quality data from Ofsted suggested that there was quality in all three routes. If anything, university-led routes were slightly higher quality, and certainly there were more teachers because of the different numbers on the different routes being trained in high-quality university-led schemes. So there was no obvious quality reason for reforming initial teacher education in a way that was different from the conventional wisdom. Could have tried to ratchet things up that way. But then we were faced with a different narrative. This quotation was one that Di used this morning, as it happens, from Michael Gove, the first Secretary of State for Education in the coalition government. Teaching is a craft, and it's best learnt as an apprentice observing a master craftsman or woman. And that, interestingly enough, was something we'd encountered as an argument in the 1990s. When I gave my inaugural lecture at Goldsmiths in 1991, I pointed to sort of extreme lunatic right views that you didn't need teacher training, and indeed, as Di, I think, indicated this morning, teacher training could actually make teachers worse. And they just needed subject study and then could be trained on the job. And this became converted into government discourse 20 years later. Michael Gove had clearly learnt the script of those new right pamphleteers. And again, I think Di used this morning, education departments are the problem. And therefore, we have taken a number of steps to put teachers and schools in charge of recruitment and training, as well as education research. There are new right pamphleteers these days who will go even further. This is a rather nice quote from The Spectator. Why not introduce a rule which states that, I can't read that from here, that no one with a formal teaching qualification is allowed to teach in any school unless they have some compensatory qualification or experience, including working in private sector, being in the armed forces, or at a pinch having got a good honours degree from a Russell Group university. Now, that hasn't quite become government policy, but sometimes, as you would see from those quotes I gave you earlier, not too far. And we got a significant expansion of Teach First, School Direct being the program which would put money into schools rather than universities, Troops to Teachers, program for training ex-service personnel, and Ofsted tighter restrictions, led to a new topography of initial teacher education, which you can see is more complicated than the earlier chart I gave you, translates into something that looks a lot more messy, to use a word that some people have used about it. And you can see in these figures how rapidly there has been a move from university-led teacher training provision into schools-led teacher training provision. University numbers going down, the school-led numbers going rapidly up. So, a couple of other things also happening, something that I've called branded professionalism, where you've got academy school chains, which are the equivalent of charter school management providers in the US. What do you call them? Charter school management organizations. And that's really pitched at the weakness of university-led teacher training, and they set up their own training programs which are becoming big. The other thing you've got, which again was mentioned this morning, is actually deregulated professionalism, to use another term that I have coined, which may seem a contradiction in terms, but basically, as Ian mentioned this morning, academies and free schools, like private schools, don't have to employ teachers with qualified teacher status. So every school could, in theory, train its own. Now, we had, again, Ian mentioned this morning, the Carter Review, which basically said things weren't as bad as the government made out and found quality in all routes to training, but also said under the coalition the system has become complex and confusing. And so we get to a situation where my successor as director of the Institute said recently, the immediate likelihood is further expansion of school-led training despite its challenges and difficulties. And he predicted that many universities would not stay in the market for long because teachers' supply into universities, training supply into universities was going to be unpredictable, which meant, he said, the de facto transfer of teacher supply to several thousand competing small businesses. But nevertheless, not all universities are withdrawing from teacher education. In fact, I think only 3 have so far, Ian. And there are universities like Bath Spa, which even in this inauspicious context for university-led schemes has chosen to remain a major player in initial teacher education and even expand its provision through a new Institute for Education, placing emphasis on the development of new partnerships. And why this is and how they've developed their offer in these challenging times is the subject of our 2 case studies. The first one by Kate Reynolds, looking at the general move towards schools-led initial teacher training and how Bath Spa has responded. And then Pat Black will talk about that specific programme I mentioned, Troops to Teachers. Kate.
Thank you very much, Geoff, and let me see if I can work this thing. My name's Kate Reynolds. I'm peculiar, and I always tell people this, because before joining Bath Spa University, I was a policy wonk. Okay, I did about 20 years in various forms of local government, central government, sitting in the world of policy implementation and policy development. So I get fascinated. I was also a BERA member throughout all of that time as well. So it came when I could, but the world of policy doesn't necessarily allow you to do that. And I've tweaked what I want to say a little bit in the light of what was being said in part 1 this morning, because what is resonating with me is a couple of things about whether actually what researchers are interested in, and this may be very simplistic, but maybe researchers are interested in questions and policymakers are interested in answers. And that's one of the difficulties that we have in terms of getting the educational research message across to people who, and if I give you a little example, I used to work in Swindon. I reported to the Deputy Prime Minister because I was part of an intervention team. I knew whatever was on the radio as I drove into work in the morning would be that which would dominate my entire day in terms of what elected members were interested in. So if there was a piece on free school meals, by 9 o'clock I had to give a briefing on what was going on in my area on free school meals. So I think that whole issue about time lags is really, really interesting. So we're going to talk a bit about schools-led ITE. The other title for this, I had 2 titles to this, is called Knitting with Jelly. And it's because as Dean of Education at Bath Spa, which I joined in January 2014, I feel sometimes I'm sort of sitting in my office with a pair of knitting needles, and I just about manage to balance the jelly on the end of the knitting needles. And actually then I get an email from our friends at NCTL who tell me they've changed the entire way that teacher education would be funded or how it would be allocated, or will take the cap off the numbers but still have a national target and not tell you about it, so you'll have to second guess whether you or not you can recruit your teachers, and it all falls apart again. So we live in this world of, particularly in England, of constant change, and I'm not seeking to exaggerate that. Those of you will know that actually in late June, July, we get told by NCTL that they've taken the cap off in terms of teacher numbers for 16-17, but they have a national target for university places and school direct places. They might share that with us. We don't know yet. So actually we're recruiting blind, in a sense, to use that term. We don't know what our numbers are going to be. That makes it extremely difficult for us, and as well as knitting with jelly, it was that lovely image that Gemma Moss had of Alice and David Cameron in her talk. I'm never quite sure whether I'm Alice banging my head on the table or David Cameron sort of sitting there going, it's complicated, isn't it? So in terms of our approach at Bath Spa, I want to give you a little bit of a feel for us. I don't normally do this, but I want to give you a feel because I think the issue about teacher education and where it rests in universities is about the university context and the types of universities as well. We are a very small university. We have between 6,000 and 7,000 students. If I told you that our head count of the number of students who are engaged in education in some way, shape or form is 2,000, that shows you the sort of power and the importance of what we do in the School of Education, now the Institute for Education. So I wanted to give you a feel for that. I was appointed specifically by our Vice-Chancellor to do things like go and influence policy. I have the joy of going to the Conservative Party fringe meeting organised by Million Plus in a couple of weeks to talk about it. Oh dear, see, and I'm already on 3 minutes. I always do this, I talk too much. Right, so what did we do? Okay, let's skip that one. What we did, apart from the last bullet point, what we did was we made a decision to be engaged, to not walk away from these new initiatives and to actually say, how do we make these ours? We are engaged in every initiative going. At Bath Spa, if there's another initiative around teacher education, we take it, we grab it, we make it our own. I had a conversation with somebody who's involved in researchers in schools a couple of weeks ago, which it can only be done through School Direct, but we're now talking about how we flip that actually, and we develop a course which is about PhD students with QTS at the same time. So we're very, very engaged in what it is we do, and that was central to the decision that we made at Bath Spa. Why did we do that in the university context? Very quickly, big issues for the university. All universities are facing these in terms of globalisation, the role of technology and national education policies. Part 1 and Part 2 have looked at those. Our approach, as well as engaging critically with the new landscape, is also about building a research programme, Diversity in Teacher Education, reflecting on the moat work that Geoff did and trying to look again at that new landscape. And you'll see these papers are part of trying to understand that. And then in particular, what we have done, and I don't make any claims for this, so this is predominantly both some of the staff in this room, Pat, who will talk about Troops to Teachers later, and Claire Furlonger, who together head up our ITE provision. They have built a reputation and a brand around that notion of democratic professionalism that Geoff was talking about. And central to that, and I want to rework this quote at some point, is this notion about agents of change. And I hold to that, hold to that because part of my role is as a leader in terms of my Dean of Education role, that actually the people in this room, my teacher educators, must be agents of this change as well. So, quickly, a number of responses. Firstly, what we've done is to engage and build strategic partnerships. We're involved with all our local diocesan boards. We're involved with 12 teaching school alliances who have research a part of what they do. We have 670 school partners. I am chair of a multi-academy trust, and in the job description for the deputy chief exec of that multi-academy trust are the words to work with Bath Spa University on teacher education. So we're actually writing it into people's job descriptions. One of our responses. Second one, to engage with and build strategies for teacher education, particularly around social media. We've changed our profiles substantially. We have a hashtag called Be Creative, Be a Teacher. Might sound silly, but when the DFE start mimicking what you do, you start to think you might be at least getting it right. So that's another thing that we've done. The third is to engage and build strategies to influence and change policy. As a result of lobbying by the Vice-Chancellor and myself to David Laws when it was the coalition government, there is now a field within the Teachers' Workforce Survey which asks them which route to qualified teacher status did they take. If we hadn't done that, it actually becomes very difficult to understand and research that data. So we sit on all the right bodies. I've got to do some work with NCTL about accountability in teacher education. We make sure we're there, we make sure we're engaged. So, you could ask yourself, and I do ask myself, and I'm asked by my bosses, whether or not it works. If I tell you that at Bath Spa we have bucked the national trend, Geoff gave you some figures about the role of School Direct. We recruited to all our places for 15-16, including maths in primary school. So we had 100% recruitment to the places we were allocated. Our School Direct partners are running at 2/3, they're only 2/3 full. We have a very, very strong reputation about what it is we do. We have increasing recognition from NCTL, and they talk to us about teacher education policy. So my response, I suppose, has to be get engaged with this. Be the agent of change, because if we don't do it, it will be done unto us. Thank you. Is that all right? There you go.
So I'm going to talk this afternoon about Troops to Teachers. And Troops to Teachers was one of the solutions to the many problems in teacher education. And I have to say, I feel as if it was Gore's special route, because he watched it entirely from beginning to where it is, and I think even now looks over it. It was one of his ideological solutions, not built on research in any way, other than the T3 program in America, which I'll talk about. But clearly the two documents and the importance of teaching and the implementation plan has absolutely changed our lives as professionals in teacher education. But when the coalition government came to power, I'm forgetting about the slides. That's me. When it came to power, they had some other problems as well as education. There were 7,000 troops to be relocated. They were coming from bases closing in Germany and from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there were all of these skilled people who were coming back home to England looking for new professions. Now, troops wasn't going to solve that problem. At one time, it was suggested there might be 7,000 coming into teaching, but it was going to be a little part of that problem. And I'm just going to flick a couple on. We'll go past him, we'll come back to him. And this notion that the country has an obligation to support our armed services coming back. And as I say, troops was one of part of that. Another one. Mr. Gove saw them as being the ideal candidates. That's really important because, as Geoff was saying, one of the problems with teacher education was the quality of people coming into the profession. One of Mr. Gove's problems, no one else's. But when they were going to be the ideal candidates with that bring with them the military ethos, the disciplines, the values, the teamwork, the leadership. So really, we didn't have a lot to do. They were almost there already. All we had to do was tell them about education, and everything would transfer over. And the slogan that was to be used was "Take it with you." And there was a little box, and out of the box came all of the skills that they would bring with them. So the Troops to Teachers programme was branded with "Take it with you." Now, we did have to tell them to leave some of it behind, that they couldn't take everything with them, and that was one of the little things that we came across. Let me just check where I am in the slides. So the birth of the programme. The tender came out in 2012, 10.1 million for the Troops to Teachers programme. And Bath Spa, along with 6 other universities, took the decision to go into a joint bid. We wouldn't stand alone. There's safety in numbers, and we knew it was under close scrutiny. So we decided to bid with 6 other universities for the programme. We were aware of the emerging negative coverage in the media and the fact that it was so closely linked to Gove. And everybody had an opinion on what Troops to Teachers would do. But they were tended to be at polar ends. You know, the politicians, etc., had this notion that they would solve education's problems. And at the other side, everybody was saying, well, what's it all about? What is this about? And will they make good teachers? We were going to create a programme. Now, that's a fabulous opportunity to start from scratch. 7 universities, a room full of academics that couldn't agree on one thing, I have to say. The meetings were hell on earth. I was a bit of an observer for a while because it was my first time to be involved with so many academics in this way. But what it did do is we put all of our programmes, and remember, programmes that we had built our reputation on, we put them on the table. And we looked at what from those programmes might be useful for this particular group of people coming out and for the schools that they were going to go into. And remember, they were targeted at low-income schools with discipline problems. They were going to solve it. So we had to compromise. We had to come to some agreement, but yet hold on to what we believed in. We had to consider the applicants. Remember, these people had seen battle in Iraq and Afghanistan, and with some sort of horrific stories that they tell you. It was to be a 2-year programme, salaried, school-based. Level 4 they came in with, and we'd worked with the 2 years. But the level 4 that they came in with was on things that we knew nothing about. One of our local service leavers worked on vertical takeoff aeroplanes. Now, you can imagine selling him to a school. Fortunately, the head I know well and said, well, don't worry, when the children are on the ceiling, he'll know how to take them down from it, and vice versa. It was to be a blended approach to learning because it was going to be a national programme. So, for instance, BASPA has the responsibility of teaching the curriculum to the primary students across the country. So it had to be done through intensive study weeks and through webinars. So it made us look at how we deliver our programme. So we started to, and I think we developed a sort of almost like a new wisdom. The things that we held dearly, we started to say, is there another way to do this? What other way can we present this? So it was a sort of what if. I mean, Kate and I talk about what if. What if we try this? What would happen? We knew it was going to be under close scrutiny from Mr. Gove. So we had DFE at every session we did in the intensive study weeks, taking notes, and we had to report to the DFE very, very regularly. And all of our intensive study weeks had a series of what I call the great and the good coming to observe us and to talk. I'm ignoring my slides completely. The brand, it was Mr. Gove's brand. We had to do something about that very quickly because we got some very negative responses from schools, and we had to develop a brand that we could sell. Some surprises. We had a slow uptake in recruitment. There was a management company involved in that. There were more primary, trainees wanting to go into primary rather than secondary, and it was really a programme designed for secondary. They were highly professional and they were ready for action. We had to change our language. When giving them feedback, it wasn't to be the language of education. You might want to try something else. Have you considered? Because that's not the language they'd been used to in the military. They used to say to us, just tell it how it is. Cut out all the educational language. Going on, we've got what they call our second term of duty. I'll just go to the last one. Yeah. Oops. What's been the surprises? We rebid, we got the contract again, the consortium of universities got the contract again. There had to be more school involvement this time. There was school involvement, but there had to be more school involvement, which we've done. For BASPA, we now do a full range of pathways. We know every pathway there is. So we borrow and we share. So things that aren't working out in one pathway, we look at another pathway and think, can we do it that way? We certainly have taken on some things, but also we've given that to others. Cross-university working, it's been absolutely fantastic to meet regularly with colleagues from other universities and to look at what we're doing and how we can better it, including cross-country, because we take off and go across the country to each of the universities where we deliver the intensive study weeks. It's been fantastic staff development. Now, I don't think I've shared this enough with Kate, and I might have to do that more, because all of our young tutors are now working with tutors from other universities and other schools across the nation. And actually, you see them grow in character. I can think of 2 recently who have just come back from intensive study week. Absolutely fantastic, loving it. Webinars, we've become skilled at webinars. BASPA was voted the best webinar for actually teaching phonics. Now imagine that, teaching phonics by webinar. And I think it's certainly made us look at how we do our programs. I think we would do a lot more of the questioning why and the how, and then the what. The what's coming last. Whereas I think, if I'm honest, some of our programs, we were always looking at the what we do, rather than the why we do it or how are we going to go about it. That, I think, has been quite a positive impact. I hate to say that and link it with our leader, or our past leader, but I think we have benefited from his initiative.
Thank you, Kate and Pat. Now we're just going to try and do a bit of reflection on where it's all going in Australia and England, and whether it's going in similar or different directions. On the face of it, it looks as if they're on different trajectories, that Australia is still following the conventional wisdom, whereas England has adopted a alternative narrative. I think there were some hints this morning, actually, that England isn't totally an outlier, and some of the things England is doing is getting picked up in Australia and certainly in the US. But in terms of high-level policy, I think it is true that Australia is following the conventional wisdom and England a rather different one. But when you get down to specific initiatives, things don't look quite so different. There are more commonalities, and we mapped the issues which these programs were trying to address against each of the programs. So you've got the programs on the top, the case studies, and then you've got the issues along the bottom: quality of teaching, quality of entrance, quality of training, and so on. And so we get the first of the Australian case studies covering that range, the second covering that, and then the first of the English case studies with quite a span, and the other slightly less of a span. But you can see that in terms of the issues, there's far more overlap than the high-level rhetoric might suggest. And I think that's also true of the practice on the ground. What is actually going on in terms of how teachers are educated and prepared in these different programs. You would recognize what's going on in Newcastle if you came from Bath Spa, at least I did, and vice versa. Obviously, there are a lot of things I could talk about there, but let me just focus on one, which is the development of arguably a new conventional wisdom, which is that clinical practice models are the way to go. We saw that very clearly in the MTeach from Newcastle and in some elements of the school-led provision at Bath Spa. And when I say it's a new conventional wisdom, it's not only a new conventional wisdom on the ground in terms of what teacher educators, whether school-based or university-based, are doing. It's also a new conventional wisdom with OECD, who have famously claimed across the board the best performing countries are working to move their teacher education programs towards a model based on less on preparing academics and more on preparing professionals in clinical settings. What, of course, Michael Gove reads into that is the support of his school-based, school-led provision. But actually, what OECD was talking about was a new conventional wisdom around research-led, research-informed clinical practice. And the bit Michael Gove ignored in the OECD statements was the stress on research as a basis for clinical practice. And that, of course, is consistent with the work behind these two symposia. The BERA study last year that John Furlong led on research and the teaching profession. And although it doesn't put all its cards on the table for clinical practice, it doesn't put all its stress on that, it has at least conceptually the possibility of a number of research-based or research-led approaches. Clinical practice is the one that's most clearly articulated at the moment, and based around the notion that there's a third leg of teacher professional preparation alongside subject and pedagogical knowledge and school experience. There is research literacy. So, even despite these other different, divergent, or possibly convergent in the future high-level reform strategies, at the level of practice, we have the possibility of a reconceptualized and revitalized professionalization agenda for initial teacher education based on clinical practice, while recognizing that clinical practice means an awful lot of different things. There is at least scope for the sort of thing the BERA RSA report was talking about. And I was told by the president of BERA just as I was coming in that there is interest in Australia in taking that report into Australia and developing it for the Australian context, which is something we could see as an outcome of these two symposia. So one of the things I sort of take from that is maybe we are still too obsessed with national regulatory frameworks and how constraining they are. Teacher educators are always complaining that our creativity is being constrained by regulation. Well, it may be that regulation is actually a bit less important in future. And we move from the conventional wisdom that stressed that to this new conventional wisdom around clinical practice, where we have, if you like, an example of a postmodern global local axis around new forms of professional practice. And it may be these bottom-up developments supported by OECD and others may be what's happening. And we can just say to Michael Gove and Co. or Christopher Pine, actually, you're yesterday. Today is this new localized practice. But at one level, I sort of feel, be careful what you wish for. Because while we may see this as bottom-up, as was stressed this morning, waiting in the wings are much more potentially powerful global forces in the terms of global foundations and global for-profit companies like Pearson. So in that context, it may be that some of the national regulation is a defence rather than something to be too critical of. But that's just my personal thought. I don't think Jenny's even signed up to that. But as I say, we have to be aware that things are going on, and I think Simone this morning indicated very clearly how these global players can take over local initiatives to the detriment of professional values. So that is where our presentation ends. We now have Catherine Byrne from the University of Oxford, who is going to respond to what we've said.
Thanks very much indeed, and I'd like to echo Martin's thanks from this morning when he said how pleased he was to get the papers in advance, and that was really impressive across this alliance between the UK and Australia to get all the papers in advance and be able to look at the detail of the case studies. And I mean that globalization, the challenges that are presented by trying to say, well, what is going on globally, or at least internationally, in comparison between two contexts, but actually how very, very different specific local responses can be. And I was hugely reminded in reading the papers of Stephen Ball and colleagues, their analysis of how schools do policy. And if you look at how teacher education programs or universities or partnerships do policy, that was one of the most striking things about the range of contextual factors, some of which are the global context, but some of which are very, very specific, and having the detail of those case studies. And in the way that Stephen Ball talks about, the capacity of some individual schools, if they seem to be doing well, to resist pressures which other institutions, if they're under the cosh, have to succumb to. And so that kind of, what's your scope to resist or subvert or simply comply, and how different that can be. And the range of factors which may not be even to do with initial teacher education. So some of the very interesting details in Bath Spa's response about actually one of the reasons for staying involved in teacher education is because it improves their graduate destination statistics. If you look at where teachers go, they go into teaching. That's a good thing. That's a professional level qualification. So the range of responses from thinking in very secure educational terms or fight for social justice set alongside, well, what are our universities' priorities, what can we do, that the messiness that emerges because of the very individualized responses. And that was the real value of having highly specific case studies. I think that's really helpful rather than just trying to do a national comparison. The second point I was going to make, and I think it's really been covered this morning, and it's there in the kind of glaring warnings at the end. You talked in your in the abstract, the introduction to the symposium, about how can we produce a professionally defensible response to what's going on while addressing the public and political concerns that have engendered this or expressed this alarm about the quality of teachers and that. And as I was reading it, I was struck by, is it really a public concern, or is it merely a policy, political concern, the manufacturing of the crisis to which the figures, are there to respond? And there was a lot about that and the role of, the media this morning, and leaving me with the question and some of the answers about where there are public concerns, and particularly about equity. And it's interesting, your claim that all of these are about trying to address equity issues. How can the teacher education profession and the researchers actually engage very real public concerns, rather than allowing everybody else to say these are the public concerns we must, or allowing the politicians to say these are the public concerns to which we must respond. And the importance, and it was touched on this morning, of looking beyond simply universities and schools to the wider partners, and particularly parents. And I don't know what the answers are there, but I think it's really important we think about how do we address other people's, particularly I think equity concerns. The third point I would make, and I think it's, even when you're holding two countries together, and that question about are we following the same trajectory or, are we on divergent paths is, I am struck by the extent still of the current differences between England, and it is England, and Australia. And those of you who heard Simone's talk this morning, whether Australia will follow. But there are things that can get lost. So the move to the practicum or clinical practice in the very narrow definition of putting students in schools. The difference that really stood out at me in England, where we talk about partnership programs, since the early 1990s, partnership has meant in a postgraduate training year 120 days in school and 60 days in the university. Reading about the MTeach, and I think this is what you said, it's 40 days in school over 2 years. So we might kind of say, well, we're talking about the same thing and we're heading in the direction. The move in England towards school-led is on top of a position of huge, and I come from an institution that prided itself on moving to partnership before the government said, in the early 90s, that you must jump. But actually, the words that we use can actually obscure, huge differences. And I think that's a key issue about why local case studies matter. But at the moment, reading the case studies, the difference between the two contexts does strike me as still very strong. And it's why I found what Simone was arguing for this morning really powerful about if Australia can kind of see what's coming, see the shadow that's being cast, and work out, and I think, particularly the role of research to respond and prepare ourselves to respond so that the evidence is there. And that's why I found the papers really, really helpful in saying, let's look in detail. And it's possible in Australia because the Master of Teaching and the, I always forget the acronym, the Exceptional Teachers for Disadvantaged Schools, those programs have been going long enough to begin to gather evidence and how important that evidence is. So being able to say, this is where our teachers, these are their graduate employment rates, these are the kinds of schools that they're going into. That evidence is really crucial, and the evidence of the quality teaching rounds and being able, we may have different views about effect sizes and everything we can measure and, reopen this morning's debates, but actually the importance of that, and I think that's really powerful. And it's where the examples from Bath Spa just give you a sense of how frantic the situation in England is, and all we can do almost is chart what's going on. And I we really commended for saying this is what's happening, and these are the benefits that are coming out of it. But actually, things change so fast. How do we generate the evidence? And it does seem to me the scope to say, if you're talking about evidence-based teaching and evidence-based teacher education, we need to make the argument about, well, what evidence? And if we need that kind of evidence, what ought to be possible to allow us to collect it? So if you move the gateposts every 10 minutes, you will never have evidence, and it does feel that is what's happening, that it's extremely difficult. So I think making the case for, if you're saying evidence-based is what matters, what is the evidence that we need, and what circumstances allow us to collect it? And I think one of the pieces of evidence that really calls for longitudinal research is about evidence of retention of teachers, and that, that's this kind of, none of this matters in the end. Well, it matters to Pearson because they can go on and on making money from it the more teachers you churn through. But ultimately, if we want to tackle things, actually equipping teachers who are able not only to go on learning, absolutely vital that they do, but actually stick there at all, and having long-term evidence is extremely important. Just before I finish, I don't know where my timings are, but I do love knitting with jelly. I think that is the most brilliant description. And I just want to commend you for even being able to produce the diagram that says this is now the range of routes that are going on. But I think the huge challenge in terms of particularly partnership, and this is the kind of personal response that I come from a programme that has been hugely committed to working in partnership with schools and unpacking the nature of those partnerships. So the things I was left wanting to know a little bit more about. And I mean, you did brilliantly well to offer case studies at all in the time people had available, but the nature of the partnership, understanding how that works. So we began to get actually how Bath Spa is working with other universities. That's another partnership in itself, but certainly with the Australian example, so the quality teaching rounds and schools' responses to that, understanding how schools are involved in generating and reviewing and working with those models of what counts, or those places that talk about signature pedagogies. How is that working? So we get the detail, not just of what's coming out, but actually how the partnerships work. Because at the moment, it's a word that everybody seems able to claim and to mean what they want. But it's really important we get a sense of what are the principles underpinning it. But thank you for a fascinating range of examples, and I will